ahead of the April 30 deadline for banks to submit their recapitalization plans to the Central Bank of Nigeria. We have seen quite a number of moves come from some banks. However, there is still much more that we are yet to see and hear from the banks, and that now brings up, conversations around the preparedness of the banks to meet up with the deadline to submit their recapitalization plans to the Central Bank of Nigeria. And joining me now to discuss this is a professor of economics, Professor Mike Obadan. Hello, Prof, and thank you for joining us on Business Daily.
Thank you very much, ChiamakA, for having me.
Prof, let's just start off with you giving us a review as to the preparedness of banks. We understand that, we are approaching the deadline, that is the April 30 deadline given by the Central Bank of Nigeria for commercial banks and banks in general to, submit their plans regarding the recapitalization policy. How would you gauge the preparedness of Nigerian banks, especially as, like I said before, we are approaching the April 30 deadline?
Well, thank you very much. Let me say this, that what the central bank requires of the commercial banks and merchant banks at this point in time is just their plans, statement of their plans, how they intend to meet the new capital base for the different categories of banks. The actual deadline of March 26th, March 30 or 31st, 2026 still remains the same. I think the central bank wants to be sure that banks are getting prepared, to raise more capital, beef up their capital base, and hence be in a position to do good banking business. The banks obviously are at different stages of preparedness now, depending on the extant financial positions of the banks. Some are very strong, as at this point in time, a few of them, and they probably need few small or relatively small capital injections. Planning to beef up the capital base to the minimum may not be too difficult for such banks. And you have in that group, for example, the 5, relatively strong or big banks in Nigeria, Zenith Bank, Access Bank, First Bank, UBA, Guarantee Trust Bank, and so on. But there are, at the other extreme, you have some relatively weak banks, which may have very low negotiating or bargaining power, and which may find it relatively difficult, to raise capital from their own resources or from their shareholders. And so such will require, discussions with other banks, the relatively strong banks, with a view to perhaps merging with them or being acquired by relatively strong banks. And those are not straightforward, issues just to tackle. And so I want to believe that the banks are all doing one thing or the other with a view to meeting the deadline of the central bank of April 30 to submit a plan. I think it's just a plan, and implementation of that plan will follow thereafter. So, like I said, some of the big banks.
Well said, Prof. Well said there. But let's first go on a short break. When we return, my guest, who is a professor of economics, Professor Mike Obadan, will still be with me, and we look at how banks are, getting ready to beef up their capital base, especially as the deadline for the plans or submission of the plans to the Central Bank of Nigeria is fast approaching. So do stay. You're still watching Business Daily, coming to you live on Trust TV. And just before the break, I had started my conversation with my guest, who is a professor of economics, Professor Mike Obadan, where he spoke towards the preparedness of banks as the April 30th deadline approaches for banks to submit their plans to the Central Bank of Nigeria. Prof, moving away from that now, I'd like for you to speak, towards the main challenges that banks will face or are currently facing, especially, as they seek to, like we stated, beef up their capital base, especially in the area of attracting foreign investors and the viability of these investors moving forward. What are your thoughts on the challenges the banks would be facing or are currently facing?
The banks will not face the same challenges. The challenges will relate to the current strengths and weaknesses, of the banks. Like I mentioned before, the relatively strong banks that have, reasonable, sizable amount of capital, even far beyond the minimum that is currently existing, those ones may not have the same challenges as the banks whose capital adequacy at the present time is very low. That is to say, there are some banks that are not able to meet the minimum capital adequacy ratio of about 10% at this point in time. Those ones will definitely have challenges trying to raise funds, through various sources, either by attracting foreign investors to come in, or to raise funds through, public, offers, subscriptions, or raise funds through issuing of shares, selling of shares to extant shareholders. That is through rights, as it were. So the challenges for such categories that are relatively challenged at this point in time would be to how to inspire confidence, either in their shareholders to put in more money or in the general public to subscribe to their shares. But I think what is likely to happen is that the relatively weak banks at this point in time may need to approach the relatively strong ones, for mergers, or outright acquisitions. But you see, those banks will be doing so from a relatively weak position. So whatever the discussions and negotiations outcomes may not be too favorable to them. So the challenge it really is for the relatively weak banks to be able to convince, members of the public or foreign investors or even their external shareholders to bring more money, put more money into those banks. So their option may not be, putting in fresh money as such, but to see how to align, with existing, banks that have, the muscle, financial muscle to acquire them, or to merge with them. For two banks that have relatively equal strengths, the issue may be how to merge together. But then there are still technical matters to be sorted out. If banks are merging, or being acquired by another one, the existing shareholders, how do you value, their shares in the new bank that they are going to, and so on and so forth. So those are issues that may take some time, in resolving, the modalities for mergers, the modalities for acquisitions, such that by the end of the deadline in March 2026, all the banks would have been seen to have met the deadline of raising the minimum capital for their categories based on their relative strengths and weaknesses.
Prof, I would like for us to speak to the outlook of the banking sector. So looking ahead, how do you, foresee the banking sector in Nigeria, evolving to the response to these regulatory changes? Moving forward, what is your outlook for the banking sector?
Well, let me say that in light of this recapitalization program, the outlook is bright. As at this point in time, the financial sector, the banking sector, had faced very serious challenges. Kind of shocks, exogenous shocks, policy shocks. And then you find some of them have been struggling. So, and their capital bases had gradually eroded. And then confidence, in the banks, more or less diminishing. And so with this recapitalization program, if all the banks in one way or the other meet the new minimum capital base in terms of either injecting new funds by existing shareholders or attracting new shareholders or attracting foreign investors or through mergers and acquisitions, the banks will become stronger. The banks would have, sizable liquidity because they would then, at that point in time, become recapitalized. And when they are recapitalized, then the general public's confidence in the banking sector will increase substantially. And I also envisage a situation that with the new minimum capital, if met, then some of the banks will be in a good position to finance very large ticket projects, in the economy. So as it were, I believe within the framework of the recapitalization program, the outlook of the banking sector is bright. Then the challenges they are having in the area of poor quality assets, capital adequacy would be minimized to a large extent. And they would be in a better position to lubricate the economy financially, much better.
Prof, do you see any international financial institutions, playing a role or supporting Nigeria banks towards, growing their capital base and meeting with the deadline issued by the CBN?
Yeah, there is a possibility. Already some of the big banks, had the advantage of getting exposures, to foreign capital. And some of the big banks have been able to borrow money from international financial institutions markets, to operate, within the country. And I believe that they already have a strong, linkage with international financial organizations. And since they are relatively doing well, so there is a possibility that foreign financiers will show interest, in supporting, some of these banks financially to meet the new minimum capital base. So I think that possibility is there for those categories of banks that are relatively doing well. But for the ones that are at the bottom, I'm not optimistic that they will be embraced by foreign, financiers to help them beef up. And that's why they may cease to exist, by being acquired or by other banks or by merging, with other banks. So it's
Well
possible
said,
that
Prof.
some
Well
of the
said there.
banks.
I have been speaking with Professor Mike Obadan, who is a professor of economics, and he has spoken largely to the deadline that we are approaching. That is the April 30 deadline for banks to submit their recapitalization plans to the CBN. Although he spoke as to the challenges that smaller banks and merchant banks are expected to face moving forward. Thank you again, Prof, for all the insight on today's edition of the program.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Well, this is where we say our goodbyes on this episode of Business Daily that is coming to you live on Trust TV. Join the conversation on social media. Let us hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on banks trying to beef up their capital base? And what are your thoughts on the options that are available for banks across the country? My name is ChiamakA Enendu. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.